So, hello YouTube. I am joined today by. I know that your first name is pronounced Andrew, but I didn't ask how to pronounce your second name. So,
Uh,
yeah,
it's Sepielli.
right, sepia. Okay, well that's just how it looks. That's basically pronounced how it looks. Okay, okay. Well, I kind of messed up the introduction there, but I'm going to keep that in. That works.
Okay.
Andrew Sepielli, and you've written you've written a book called Pragmatist Quietism, which you should probably say a little bit about so that people can go and find out about it. Do you have a brief little advert that you want to you want to do for the book?
Right, sure. Thanks very much, Kane. The book is a defense of metaethical quietism. This is basically the view that there are ethical truths that don't require, and neither do they admit of vindication from sort of realms outside of ethics, like the metaphysics of moral properties or the semantics of moral expression. So ethics is sort of like its own autonomous, free-floating sphere, and that may sound a little strange. So the bulk of the book is devoted to explaining how such a view could nonetheless be correct. It's right here. It's available from Oxford University Press. Um, yeah, that's about it.
Okay, yeah. So so the view this pragmatist quietist view. You said that I guess maybe the best way to start would be with like just the sort of basic motivation of it. So this idea that um, okay, I guess there's a sort of tradition in metaethics where we are, as you see it, we're trying to either kind of vindicate or undermine ethics like from the outside. So, there are these arguments, say, for instance, the argument from queerness, which would say,
Mhm.
like we ought not to believe in moral properties because moral properties are queer in some way. They're hard to fit in with a naturalistic worldview or something like that. Um, and so there's these debates about the metaphysics of moral properties, about the semantics of moral terms, and in one way or another, these are supposed to vindicate or undermine ethical inquiry, and that's sort of the tradition that you see yourself as opposing, right?
That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, so, I mean, I think that just the kind of initial question that I would have about this is um, so as you see it then like ethics is something that's just kind of autonomous or isolated
Hmm.
the only things that are like really relevant to ethics are those arguments that are going to be like of first order ethical significance. We're never kind of judging it from the outside, as it were. um, but I guess like the way that I've always tended to approach philosophy is I just see I tend to just see that as being maybe like what philosophy is. Like it just seems that philosophy always involves this kind of stepping back, right? So if I think about I don't know philosophy of science, right? As a scientist who's trying to decide which theory to adopt, doesn't really matter whether you take a realist or anti-realist view of scientific theories. It doesn't make a difference whether you're like a hardcore realist or a Kuhnian historicist or a constructive empiricist. There's all these like philosophical views from the point of view of a scientist engaging in scientific inquiry. Doesn't seem like it's going to make much difference which position they adopt. But then when we start doing philosophy, it's like, okay, we step back from the practices and we like ask, all right, well, like is science getting at the truth? Similarly with like maybe ordinary objects, right? Like as just an everyday person describing the objects in my room, I say there's a table, there's a computer, there's a light over there, and I'm not really going to think about okay, well, are these like really do these objects really exist, or are they merely particles arranged table wise or whatever?
Right. Right.
But then when we do philosophy, we step back and start asking about the foundations of the inquiry. And so you know, like I guess maybe actually I do know because you endorse a more sort of global pragmatism. But I suppose the kind of question I'm just asking is, well, isn't it the case that this like stepping back, that's sort of just what philosophy is, isn't it? uh, yeah.
Right, right. Well, I think one would want some kind of story about why the metaphysics of moral properties and semantics of moral expression, things like that, right? The
Hmm.
traditional pillars of metaethics. One would want a story um, about why those things are irrelevant or beside the point in the way that I'm claiming they are. Um, and so I have that kind of story. I mean, the basic idea, and I have a sort of first pass version, a second pass version, a third pass version. But
Right.
the basic idea is that what we tend to call normative ethical inquiry. So, should we turn the trolley, or is utilitarianism true? That sort of thing. That sort of inquiry is not representational. It's you can't improve the accuracy of your overall representation or picturing of the world by taking one side or the other of these kinds of debates. But my thought is that things like the metaphysics of moral properties could bear on ethics only if ethical debates were representational. But if representational accuracy is just not in the cards by virtue of the kinds of debates that these are, um, then things like are there really moral properties? Are they non-natural? Are they reducible to natural properties? Those kinds of things end up being irrelevant to the matter of which, if any, ethical position we ought to adopt.
Yeah, I guess I'm sort of, I'm more like questioning the sort of initial motivation for
Mhm.
endorsing the sort of quietist position that you hold. So, um, I mean, yeah, I don't know. I was gonna sort of get into the details of it, but I think there's how should I put this? Um, so when I think about like sort of the general motivation for quietism, like one of the things that you said kind of early on in the book is that this is quite an appealing position. You know, you
Yeah,
find it appealing, right? And I suppose I'm not sure I get the appeal. So it's just
yeah,
like just the kind of intuitive like okay, well, yeah, so first of all, when I start doing philosophy, I tend to think that philosophy just is this kind of stepping back and evaluating things from like the external point of view, right? So that's one
Mhm.
thing. And then the other thing is I've always had this like feeling about quietist positions where I'm always inclined to just say, well, why are you getting involved in this debate at all then? Because wouldn't an actual quietist just go ahead and do ethics? Like why do we even need to like have this theory of pragmatist quietism? Maybe this is like just a really naive and philistine objection. I mean, it's not really an objection, but it's just more like a um, you know maybe I'm just more asking about that like that initial like intuitive appeal of this sort of view because I think if I was
Sure.
inclined to be a quietist about something I would just um I would just do the first order thing and not get involved in the second order debates. Maybe it's I'm trying to think of an
Maybe
example of
you might be
something.
just more self-assured than I am, or something. Maybe that.
Well, maybe. Actually, I don't think so. I'm not very. I don't think I'm very self-assured. But I'm trying to think of an example of where, like, I would say I'm a quietist. I mean, maybe a good case would be something like, there's like some debates about, like, so with people who are transgender, right? There's these different accounts of like what gender is, and then you get these accounts of like how we ought to use pronouns and so on. My take on it is, well, if somebody says that they're a woman, I'm just going to go along with what they say. I'll use she/her pronouns, and I don't really care about the metaphysics of gender. Like it's not, but like my decision to use she/her pronouns for somebody who claims to be a woman is not based on any sort of metaphysics of gender or any kind of scientific theory about the relation of sex and gender or anything like that. So that seems like a sort of quietist position. At the same time, I don't think there's anything wrong with engaging in debates about the metaphysics of gender. I'm sure it's very interesting. It's just not something I do. So like that feels like a kind of quietism, right?
Well,
But it's not a
let's take
theory.
that. Yeah, I mean, so let's. I mean, there's a lot to say, but let's take that debate for a second. So you want to basically respect people's choice of pronouns and so forth, and your decision to respect that doesn't hinge on any views about the metaphysics of gender or the theory of reference that determines how terms like male and female, so forth, refer.
Mhm.
Um, but of course, some people do at least claim to think that the way we ought to use these pronouns, the way we ought to classify people for various purposes, depends on sort of facts about the metaphysics of gender and these kind of the outcomes of these semantic debates. And if the majority of people thought this, and if it were really sort of distorting the discourse, which maybe you think it is, I'm not sure, but then I think you would want to kind of fight back against that and say why, it, notwithstanding the fact that it might seem obvious that the metaphysics of gender is so important, why it's actually not important. I should say, while we're having this discussion, there's an air show happening
I can hear it. Yeah.
nearby. I don't know if that's completely throwing everything
No,
off,
no.
but
It's just a nice sort of background ambient noise.
for
It's
you,
okay, right?
okay. But yeah, lest your viewers be too concerned, everything's fine. It's just an air show. Yeah, and in fact, I think that something like this distortion does happen in ethics, right? I mean, people resort to ethical nihilism because of metaphysical and semantic considerations. I think even worse than that, people's kind of first order moral views are in some way guided in certain cases by these sorts of considerations. Like, so for example, in like Elizabeth Anscombe's work, right? She rejects utilitarianism because she thinks it's a theory of what we morally ought to do, right?
Mhm.
And she has a view about the semantics of the moral ought, to wit, that the moral ought lacks sense, right? And so there can be no true theory of what we morally ought to do. And since that's what utilitarianism would have to be, utilitarianism goes out the window. Well, I'm somewhat favorably disposed towards utilitarianism, at least, certain forms of consequentialism. And at least one of my motivations is, that doesn't seem like the right kind of rationale for rejecting an ethical theory, right? That we should, change my view about how I ought to live my life, how we ought to conduct our affairs, because the semanticists have spoken and they've shown that this expression lacks sense, or whatever the case may be. And early on in the book, when I say quietism is appealing, I mean, in some sense, that's a strange thing to say, because if you go around and ask people on the street, what do you think of metaethical quietism? They'll look at you like there's something wrong with you. But what I find appealing about it is just that when I engage in ethical inquiry, I find that I don't want to advert to these kinds of metaphysical or semantic considerations, right? If it turns out that if the concept or word good refers to a certain cluster of properties, I'm not, not the inclined to want to change my views about what's good.
Hmm.
Normative ethics, in my view, should be insulated from all of that. And you have to have an explanation of how it can be insulated from it, right? Right. It's not enough just to say this is appealing and so that's what I want to believe. I think that sometimes quietists have not really told as much of a story as you would like to explain how what's good or bad or right or wrong can be, insulated from the meanings of expressions like good or bad, right or wrong,
Yeah.
or the metaphysics of wrongness and so on, right? I mean, it's on the face of it a sort of a mysterious position too.
Yeah, I suppose I think that the way that I've like just always tended to think about this is that um, you know, meta ethics just seems to be a different kind of thing to ethics, and there can be cases where people sort of bring them together in the way that Anscombe did. But I would take it that even if I'm a moral nihilist, we now have like being a moral nihilist doesn't just mean like I have to say, okay, well that's it. I'm just not going to engage in ethical inquiry. I mean, again, some people can say that, but then you can adopt a fictionalist line, or you can adopt some sort of I don't know, substitutionist sort of line, like maybe we should
Mhm.
revise moral concepts or whatever. But the point is that even if I say, okay, like I take it that all moral statements are false, um, that doesn't in itself seem to stop me from engaging in moral discourse in pretty much the same ways I always did. I just have to maybe come up with a different interpretation of it or something like that. And so to me, I guess this is, like I feel like don't we already have just in that alone, like doesn't that already provide us with the relevant autonomy of ethics? Because it seems like there's this really wide range of views you can adopt on the metaphysics, the semantics, but then you can just go ahead and keep on engaging in ethical inquiry anyway. I mean, one person will take themselves to be discovering these, non-natural truths. Another person will take themselves to be constructing a fiction. But on the first order level, they might be making exactly the same sort of arguments.
Right. Well, if you ask me to think about the nihilist who nonetheless, persists in, you know, um, moral inquiry and, kind of cares about right and wrong, cares about, political issues and so forth. I mean, I think that that person is misguided in dropping their ethical beliefs. So, for example, if they drop their ethical beliefs on the grounds um, that there are no, irreducibly normative properties, and there would have to be such things in order for these beliefs to be true, then I think that person's making a mistake. I don't know if I worry so much about that person. I mean, I think that that can have a sort of distortive effect on discourse because then people who believe in um, that some things are in fact right and wrong might start to think, well, gosh, do I have faith in something that can't really be justified and so forth. So I think there are some issues there. But what I'm really worried about, I say more than anything else, are these sorts of distortions. And Anscombe is an example, but just to talk about the book for a second, like if most of the very, very long chapter 8 of the book about moral epistemology, it's kind of just cataloging various ways in which, if we want to put this, non-quietism or foundationalism has distorted the practice of normative ethics, right? So different philosophers who've who've let their views about what seem like these meta-ethical issues, right? It's like it's a different realm or something. Like, let their views about these meta-ethical issues guide their first order normative theorizing. And in the case of Anscombe, I think that it's actively harmful. I mean, I think she has some influence, at least. I mean, where I live. But I think there are a lot of cases where this happens, where basically there's this, you know, you start to think, well, gosh, there are these challenges to ethics, right? There don't seem to be moral properties. Moral terms don't seem to have sense or reference. that sort of thing. And then somebody comes along and says, um, "Oh, but if moral properties are reducible in just this way to natural properties, then that's a sort of a way of saving ethics, right?" Or somebody comes along and says, "Oh, if moral terms refer in just this way, or if there are certain moral positions that we're committed to just by virtue of engaging um, in action or in discourse, that's the kind of Kantian or Habermasian
Mm.
position, right? Then we can save ethics, and in a way that sounds kind of nice. But when that kind of pushes people towards particular first order ethical positions, then I think it's distortive. Um, and that's at least one of if I'm speaking about my own psychology, at least one of the motivations for quietism. I mean, another sort of motivation is just like I thought a lot about what ethical debates are like, and it didn't seem, from my point of view, that any of the dominant positions in the literature really quite captured them. So I don't think ethical debates are the way that the typical cognitivist describes them, and I
Mhm.
don't think they're the way that the typical non-cognitivist describes them. I think, if anything, ethical debates are most like debates that where it seems like you're forming beliefs, right? They're not non-cognitive, but where we might say they're merely verbal or non-representational or non-substantive. So that
Mhm.
and that may seem strange, but actually that's I think once you see that ethical disputes are really, perhaps contrary to first appearances, like those sorts of debates, then a lot of the other stuff kind of makes more sense.
Okay, yeah. So, I mean, this is, I guess we should explain how this works then. So,
Yeah, yeah.
when you say that they're non-substantive, you draw this analogy to debates like, uh, uh, I think there's an example that William James uses of a man chasing a squirrel around a tree. I don't know. Do you want to explain the analogy here?
Right, yeah. So this is in the very beginning of William James's book, Pragmatism, a new word for some old ways of thinking, right? Um, and James is describing the sort of debate that he intends his pragmatism to dissolve. And it's, again, a kind of debate that today we might call merely verbal or non-substantive. So James and his hiking companion are watching a guy chase a squirrel around the tree, right? And one of them says, "Oh, look, that guy's running around the squirrel." And then the other one says, "No, no, no, he's not running around they're both going around the tree, but the man is not thereby going around the squirrel, right?" And so, one of them is thinking, well, first the man is north of the squirrel, then west, then south, then east. The other is thinking, no, 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 but the man's always in back of the squirrel. He's never to the side of it or in front of it, so he's not going around it. And that's a debate that, in James's view, is a sort of pseudo debate. I forget the exact language he uses. But again, I think today many people would think of it as being merely verbal or non-substantive. Um, it's a kind of a choice about how to talk. You're not getting the world wrong, assuming that you kind of understand the situation. You're not getting the world wrong by saying, he counts as going around the squirrel, or for that matter, by saying, he doesn't count as going around the squirrel. And then you'd want some kind of explanation. Well, okay, why is that the case? Why aren't you getting the world wrong? Why is one side no better from a representational point of view than the other, right? And like various, James's story, maybe probably like Carnap do, recently David Chalmers does and has worked on these kinds of issues. I'm leaving a lot of people out, but then I've got a kind of a view about what makes that sort of debate um, basically non-substantive too. And just to kind of wrap up, I think the kinds of disputes that we tend to call normative ethical um, are, again, kind of contra first appearances, actually, a lot like the squirrel debate.
Right. So I guess that 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 might sound a bit strange because I can imagine people saying, "Well, hang on a minute. Like, first of all, clearly, disputes in normative ethics like make a difference in a way that something like the squirrel debate just doesn't seem to. Like if I'm a consequentialist and somebody else is a Kantian deontologist, we're going to have completely different answers about what we ought to do in particular scenarios. So." That's going to it manifests in our action, and that there's these differences. And also,
Mhm.
if we're saying that it's non-substantive, then it sounds like we're saying, well, there's just no fact to the matter, and you can say anything you want. Um, so, I mean, obviously, you have some account for like, okay, this is how we're going to get ethical objectivity, even though it's non-substantive. So, could you maybe explain a bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So, the original title for this book was going to be Significance Without Substance. And then I think OUP, I guess they thought I was like kind of not famous enough to have such a, kind of poetic title. I needed something that was like more descriptive of the content of the book. But yeah, basically what I want to say about the disputes that we tend to call normative ethics. I actually think there are some normative ethical disputes that are quite different. Maybe we could get to that later. But the disputes that we tend to call normative ethical are significant, but not substantive, whereas disputes like the William James squirrel dispute are not only non-substantive, but also not significant, right? And so ethics is this kind of strange category. Like these disputes matter, right? We wouldn't want to just settle them by fiat, right? Like, I'll just define right as such and such, right? Um, and it seems like they really matter in a way that the squirrel dispute doesn't. But nonetheless, the way they matter is not because they afford some kind of representational accuracy. And the way they matter is, kind of fundamentally just what you said, Kane. They bear on what we do. I also think they bear on affect. To take a certain ethical view is, in a certain sense, to be prepared to act in certain ways under certain circumstances. Um, so there are ways in which these disputes matter, and so and I try to kind of leverage these ways of mattering into an account of ethical truth or ethical objectivity. Um, but but the fact that they matter in certain ways, right? The fact that we wouldn't want to say of them, you can go either way. You could say this, you could say that. Um, is not the same as affording accurate representation of the world in the sort of in the robust way that if I say there's a book over in ordinary circumstances, if I say there's a book over there on the counter, right, that
Mm-hmm.
affords accurate representation of the world. If there's a book there, I've got the world right. If there's not a book there, then I've represented or pictured the world incorrectly. Yeah, I hope
Yeah.
that makes some sense.
Yeah, so I guess maybe it's important to be careful about this notion of non-substantivity because like when I initially encounter something like James's example of the squirrel going around the tree, um, I suppose my initial reaction to it is, well, yeah, I mean, it just seems like semantics, as it were. It's just a matter of how you choose to
Mhm.
define, going around something, or one thing going around another. But I mean, so I get. I mean, I guess you wouldn't want to say that ethics is non-substantive in that sense. It's specifically about um, representational accuracy or like other representational values, perhaps I should say.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really useful. So I think there are a whole bunch of things that we might want to say, and that I think a lot of people do say about like the squirrel dispute, or other kinds of other disputes like that. So one thing we sometimes we say things like, you could go either way, or what's the point, right? We sometimes we say it's merely semantic, right?
Hmm.
It's about how we choose to use words. Sometimes we say, or at least I say, it's not representational, right? There's no representational accuracy up for grabs. And I'm sure there are further characterizations, but these characterizations can come apart, right? You're not saying the same thing when you say it's merely semantic as you are when you say you could go either way, and you're not saying the same thing when you say that's not representational. And so I think, whether or not they come apart in the swirl dispute, I think it's important to say that they're different things. So in a dispute like, should we turn the trolley, right? We know what's going to happen if we turn the trolley, right? And we know what's going to happen if we don't turn the trolley. Um, is a dispute like that one where you could go either way, it doesn't matter, what's the point? Well, I think the answer is no, for the reasons I said before. Do I think it's a dispute where um, the way in which it matters is that our the accuracy of our representation of the world is up for grabs? Well, there I think the answer is no. Um, Nor do I think it's, what I think of it as a semantic dispute, exactly. I mean, I don't have much of a story about what a semantic dispute is because it's
Okay.
not part of the apparatus
Right.
of the book.
Okay. Yeah. So so what's crucial then is that if we're taking something like the trolley problem, both of the parties to the dispute, um, so that they're both taken to be representing the world in the same way. Even so, the dispute still matters. One of them can still be right, and the other can still be wrong in saying that you ought to pull the lever or you ought not to. Um, yeah. Um, so I mean, I guess like isn't there so that I can imagine somebody watching this sort of saying, well, hang on a minute. In saying that that these parties to the dispute, there's no like representational accuracy at stake. Well, now it just seems like you're making some sort of semantic or metaphysical claim, right? Because I guess the way we would usually think of
Yes.
this is like um, whether or not there's representational accuracy at stake is going to depend on our semantics of moral judgments, right? Like, do moral judgments, are they taken to be referring to the world, attributing properties to things, etc. So yeah, I mean, is there a worry here that you're just kind of bringing back metaphysics and semantics into the story?
An excellent worry, excellent question. So yes. So earlier in the discussion, I said, look, this characterization of these debates in terms of substantivity or representationality is a kind of first pass characterization.
Yeah.
And it's not ultimately the one that I want to, do any theoretical work for me. And I actually think you've kind of glommed onto two of the major reasons for that. One is that if you say a debate's not substantive, then it's very difficult to see how it could have a right answer. It seems like non-substantive debates are ones where there's no right answer, right? That was one worry. I think that's a very good worry. The second worry was, well, look, here you are, Andrew. You say that ethics is independent of these other, realms of philosophy, but then if everything hinges on these debates being representational, then it actually doesn't seem like it is all that independent. And I think that's a good worry too. So ultimately, the what I want to say about these debates is not that they're non-substantive or non-representational. What I want to say about them is another evaluative claim, that they don't afford what I call truthy values. It's a little bit of a gimmicky expression, but the truthy values are values that you would tend to, at least many people would tend to associate with truth. So, the value associated with predictions of the world that match the, course of experience as it comes in. The value of kind of acting well, right? Truth is power. It helps you to act in certain ways. And I guess maybe paramount among all of these truthy values is what I call representational value. So that's the kind of value associated with accurate representation of the world. And so ultimately what I want to claim about the debates that tend to be called normative ethical is actually not that they're non-substantive or non-representational. It's a kind of first pass characterization. But really what I want to say is they don't afford truthy values. So I don't think that I'm sort of falling victim to the kinds of worries that you presented before. Now there is the question of there is the question of how of you know of how to avoid taking sides on these disputes about representationality. If, for example, one of the values is representational value, and so there are a few. I mean, we could talk about this now. I'm not sure if people would be interested, but there are kind of moves in the book that I make to avoid just being the kind of shallow anti-metaphysician who's really just pushing the bump under the rug, which
Right.
you see that all the time, right? At least I do in philosophy.
Yeah, I mean, I think that just one kind of initial concern was that I had was, well, when I think about what truthy values are supposed to be, it seems like there's been a whole load of very different ideas about what sorts of values are taken to be indicative of truth, right? So, I mean, you give like these three values of associated with, I think it was predictive value, general practical value, and representational value. Um,
Yeah.
but then so I don't know. So simplicity, right? Like simplicity is often taken to be something that's indicative of truth, and then simplicity gets interpreted in all sorts of different ways. There's like I don't know 10 different kinds of simplicity, and sometimes they pull against each other. Um, and then sometimes like there's like a kind of anti-simplicity. I've sometimes seen ontological heterogeneity suggested as a value that we should take as indicative of truth. Um,
Oh, interesting.
yeah, and then there's sometimes people take it that like I don't know mathematical elegance might be indicative of truth. We believe the theory to be true because it's so elegant, and so it, like I don't know is there a concern here that you know I suppose that maybe one way to put this is maybe our judgment of like what counts as a truthy as a value that is associated in some way with truth um, is kind of downstream of just whatever we're taking as the values that are guiding our beliefs. Um, I don't know if that makes sense, but it just seems like so okay. I mean, there was a point when it was thought that the one of the like constraints on theorizing about the way the world is, at least the empirical world, is that it has to our best theories have to provide mechanical explanations. Like things, atoms in the void pushing and pulling each other, or whatever. Um,
Yeah.
and then Newtonian mechanics comes along, and it turns out that it has amazing predictive power, but it's also got this weird like action at a distance thing with gravity just being this like force, like occult force. And so what did we do? Well, we just got rid of the idea that mechanical explanation is associated with truth.
Right.
Um,
Right.
so I can't help but feel like these values associated with truth are sort of very flexible. And
Yeah.
I'm thinking, well, if we're going to claim that ethical inquiry is guided by certain values, and that's we should believe certain things because uh, they satisfy these values. I don't know, why shouldn't that why aren't we just taking that as indicative of truth in just the same way as we might take predictive power to be indicative of truth?
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, I should say, at this point, we're getting pretty deep into the kind of conceptual apparatus of the book, which I think is great. But yeah, I mean, if anybody watching this, like, if this kind of back and forth doesn't make any sense, you should pick up the book and maybe it'll make more sense. Um, but so just to kind of address this issue, well, what I'm calling the truthy values are not intended to be values that are sort of merely indicative of truth, right? So what I called predictive value is supposed to be something that to which truth is instrumentally related, right? If you believe the truth, then assuming certain other conditions hold, it'll tend to be the case that your predictions of experience as it comes in are going to match it well enough so that life doesn't seem like just a kind of constant like confusion or acid trip or something like that, right? Um, Similarly, like uh, you know, it seems like I'm kind of intuitively that truth is instrumentally related to what I'm calling general practical value, right? Like seems like if you believe the truth, then that will sort of help you navigate the world in the way that like an accurate map will help you navigate the world, to kind of get you where you're going, regardless of where actually it is. If you want to go, right? If you want to avoid going to the air show down the street, then a map will help you. If you want to get there, a map will help you. And then when it comes to representational value, that seems like the kind of value that in some ways is like the closest to truth as it's ordinarily conceived, because representational value seems like the kind of thing that inheres in truth, right? Like it's not like Bible. It's not if you believe the truth that will like cause you later to represent the world accurately. It's to believe the truth is to sort of picture the world accurately. So it's just that's a kind of long-winded way of saying these values are not supposed to be values that are merely indicative or evidence of truth. They're sort of related to truth in different ways. Um, and but the general point that you're making seems to me right, that there are lots of values that seem to be in some ways sort of bound up with truth. Um, and so how do I handle that in the book? The kind of flippant answer is I insert the word generally into my characterization of quietism just to kind of brush those values aside. The less flippant answer is I'm really concerned with the kinds of values upon which um, the sort of traditional pillars of metaethics might be might be taken to bear, right? So for example, you know, I think if you asked a lot of like moral, traditional moral realists or error theorists, um, do you think that whether there are non-natural moral properties bears on whether our moral beliefs represent the world accurately? I think they would say yes, of course they do. Um, and so it's the sort of values that seem to be bound up with truth that it seems like you know meta ethical inquiry might plausibly be taken to bear. Like those are the ones I'm most. That's why I focus on those sort of in particular, because I have a particular sort of opponent in mind, right? The opponent who says, "Gosh, unless there are irreducibly normative properties, then all of our moral beliefs are false." And then might go on to say, "Yes, there are such properties, so we're saved," or "No, there are not such properties, and so we've got to give up our moral beliefs." Like I'm I'm focusing on certain values because I have a certain sort of opponent in mind, the kind of traditional meta-ethicist, you might call
Yeah.
this
Okay.
person.
Um, so on your view then, if as I understand it, the claim is that the the reason why metaphysics, semantics, these other sorts of considerations don't bear on like ethics is because they can only bear on whether to accept a view um, if when they bear on the truthy values. But
Yeah.
normative ethical debates are not guided by truthy values. So that's the reason. Did I get that right?
It's not, it's basically, it's not that they're not guided by them, because some people might be engaged in normative ethical debates and falsely think that they
Oh, okay, yeah,
afford truth, right?
right,
It's that if you want to put it in a stilted way, that the sort of accrual of truthy value is not possible in the debates that we tend to call normative ethical. So, for example, should we turn the trolley? Is utilitarianism true? It's just not. It's just not up for grabs in those sorts of debates.
yeah. Is there is there a worry here that you've said that one of the reasons that motivated you to adopt this sort of quietist position is that you were bothered by the distorting influence that certain meta-ethical views had on the first order debates, right? So it seems like you would accept that there are certain meta-ethical positions where they can have like ethically bad consequences if we accept them. Um,
Yeah.
and so like if I adopt a certain metaphysical and semantic framework, then that ends up having these ethically bad consequences. And so is that now but like isn't that going to be a way even under your framework for debates about the metaphysics and the semantics to like get back in? Because I mean we are so you're saying, hey, Elizabeth Anscombe has this like metaphysical and semantic framework which has these distorting influences on ethical inquiry, and that's like a kind of ethical evaluation of the meta ethics and semantics, but it's still a kind of evaluation of it, and it looks like we could still assess these different meta-ethical and semantic theories from that point of view. Um, is that a worry? I mean, I don't know if that made sense. I may not have expressed that very well.
No, no, it absolutely makes sense.
Yeah.
So, my view is that these sorts of um, you know like the metaphysics of moral properties and the semantics of moral expressions, that these don't bear on what's right and wrong, good or bad, and so on. I think, but that doesn't preclude me from evaluating um, um, one's acceptance of certain meta-ethical positions in sort of ethical terms. So there's like a point, elsewhere in the book where I say, I don't know, what if you come across somebody you know, who, kind of persists in thinking, right, that some things are right and wrong, only if there are these irreducibly normative properties. What advice should you give to this person if you're like a pragmatist like me? And um, I think you should try to get them to give up that sort of crutch. But to the extent that they can't, then you should say, okay, go on, keep believing in these sorts of properties. Like this is going to sound mean, but I think that there are certain meta-ethical views that are like ethically speaking worse than others, and like I think like stuff like Anscombe is um is like the worst. I mean, she's very smart. It's not a it's not a knock against her acumen, but I think her approach is like the worst, whereas others may not be so bad. Like when you start looking at stuff like there's a paper by Robbie Williams about the reference of ethical terms. It was like in Phil Review a couple years ago. And that managed to like basically preserve most of what I care about when it comes to the autonomy of ethics. And, right, and that seemed like basically fine. Like that didn't seem evil.
Okay.
It's not ideal, but it's not the worst.
Right. Okay. I mean, so yeah, it's so yeah. I don't know. It still seems like okay. Well, so we maybe it's okay to engage in this sort of stuff as long as you're doing it in a morally acceptable way. We just don't need to. Maybe is the yeah. So
Well, there are certain myths. There are certain myths that if people, it's like with any other thing. Like there's certain myths that if people accept them, it's not really that bad.
right.
And there are other myths that if people if people believe in a God that counsels you to like sacrifice children or something, that would be like a worse myth to believe in. And if people believe in a God that doesn't exist, but counsels you to be nice to people, that seems like a better myth to believe in. I mean, ideally, you'd want to just like be nice to people, regardless.
Hmm.
But if you have a difficult time giving up this link between God's commands and being nice to people, it's like, yeah, it's like if I were talking to somebody like that, I'd be like, you should get over that. But if you don't get over that, believe in the God who tells you to be nice, not the, just from an ethical point of view, not the child sacrifice God.
Right. Okay. Yeah. Um, so I suppose the big question is like, okay, you're going to claim that there are like certain ethical truths, that there is ethical objectivity. So I mean, how do we actually get that right? Like, how do we get that from your sort of position? Um, yeah. What's the is there a reasonably brief way you can outline outline the move there?
Reasonably brief. Yeah. So,
Sorry, it
yeah.
doesn't have to be
So,
that brief. Just
no, no, no.
I mean, obviously the answer is well, go and read the book, but
Right. Yeah,
that's
yeah. That's like the briefest way. Yes.
right.
Right. So, so the so just to kind of go back to this language of like just sort of representational value and truthy value and so forth. So I think that in these debates that we tend to call normative ethical, they don't afford um, truthy values, but I
Mhm.
think that they afford what I call specifically ethical values, right? That the value of doing the right thing, the value of doing it for the right reason, the value of looking at other people in the right sort of way. Um, and there's a certain point in the book where I try to basically construct a sort of, you might call it a lightweight notion of truth from the sort of resources of these specifically ethical values. And and so the basically the way it goes is um, uh, um, an ethical belief is true just in case it's part of a set of ethical beliefs, such that if an otherwise ideal advisor held that set of beliefs, that the advice that they would give to people would be advice to do all and only right actions. So there are a few bits of that apparatus, like it's kind of constructs truth out of what I'm calling specifically ethical value. It involves an ideal, as of an idealization that ends up being important,
Mhm.
and the fact that it brings in an advisor ends up being important too. But yeah, so one again, maybe one last thing to say about this is, it may seem, kind of strange, this sort of idea that like, okay, you're kind of constructing like ethical truth out of the resources of like ethical value, and you think, well, shouldn't it really go the other way? You've got to like show what the truths are in the world, and some of these will be truths about what's valuable, and right, and it seems like I'm going the other way. And the answer to that is like, yes, I am going the other way. And that's kind of what pragmatism, at
Mm.
least as I understand it, is all about. Um, I mean, it one thing that I sort of touch on in this section about this kind of lightweight sort of ethical truth is like kind of why I'm not a minimalist about about this sort of, it's lightweight, but it's not supposed to be a minimalist theory of truth. And I know you've got another video where you explain why you don't like quasi-realism, and one of the reservations is that quasi-realists often resort to a sort of minimalist view of truth. And I think you've got a nice criticism there. And although I don't address you by name in the book, like part of the motivation for not being a minimalist is like, something along the lines of what you say in the other video.
Okay, yeah. So I suppose just to go back to this point that, like there's a traditional way of approaching this stuff where, we start off with what the truths are and then we get what the values are. And you're
Yeah.
reversing that. I mean, I would take it that one of the main motivations for the traditional approach is there's a kind of puzzle about like, well, how do we come to like just decide between alternative sort of value sets? And at least on the traditional approach, you kind of have a very straightforward answer where you say, well, the right answer, so the correct answer about what values we should adopt is just given to us by the truths, right? So we have these
Yeah.
truths that are independent, and then that fixes what the right answers are. And I mean, there may be objections. There's plenty of objections to that sort of view, but it is at least straightforward. We can sort of see how you get these right answers. And whereas on your kind of approach, like I guess I can see how we can construct truth. I think truth is something. Uh, it's again one of these very slippery notions. I think and so if you can have like different views of truth where like maybe. Well, I mean, if somebody's like just a straight up relativist, they can say, look, there are moral truths, but the moral truths are just relative to individual values. So, boom, you've got truths, but it's not really the sort of truth that an objectivist would want, right? And
Right.
so, yeah, I suppose the question for me is like, how are we, how are we getting to objective truth? How are we establishing that there's like this objectivist truth uh, concerning ethics. Because it seems like with the ideal advisor, we could just say, well, our conception of what counts as an ideal advisor or our conception of what right action is. So the ideal advisor is going to advise us to do the right action, but then our conception of right action is just going to depend on whatever our prior value commitments are. Um, so it doesn't feel like we've gotten objectivity to me.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So it's some nice points. I mean, when I talk about objectivity, um, I mean, this gets a little bit complicated in the last chapter of the book, but we can get there maybe later. But I mean, basically, what I have in mind is something like stance independence.
Yeah.
And so when oh, you're frozen there. Oh yeah, there you go.
Oh.
So yeah. So when I say that, like I'm an objectivist quietist, I mean that there are these there's this sort of independent autonomous realm of ethical truths, and these truths are ones that imply that at least part of ethics is independent of our stances. So, like for instance, um, ceteris paribus, causing pain to an innocent creature is wrong, and it would be wrong even if I didn't disapprove of it, even if the most people didn't disapprove of it, and so on. So that's just what I mean by objective. It's not supposed to be anything sort of more heavyweight than that. Um, on the question of, yeah, basically, like if you're a pragmatist, you kind of confront this question of like which set of values do you sort of go with. Um, you're right. You do confront that question. I think there's a parallel question for my opponent, the person I will call the representationalist. The representationalist has different accounts of truth, and then there's or different accounts of what there is in the world,
Hmm.
and then there's the question of which of those to go with, and then it seems like at least on the face of it, you'd have to resort to some account of what there is or what's true to justify going with some account of truth over some other account of truth. So there's a kind of explanatory bedrock that eventually everybody's going to hit, and it's a different bedrock for the pragmatist than it is for the representationalist. But it's not as if I think the representationalist somehow avoids problems of this sort
Yeah.
entirely. Um,
Yeah, I think so. I think I agree with that, but I still feel like there might be that there. So in terms of like the epistemology, I'm kind of inclined to think they're sort of on the same footing. But there's this. I think there is a further question of like, all right, so what is it that makes, like, if I'm asking a representationalist, what is it that makes your beliefs privileged in some sense over other beliefs? And they just have this very straightforward answer where it's like, oh, well, my beliefs just match the way the world is. And of course, the question of like, well, what there's a question of what justifies them in believing that their beliefs match the way the world is, and I think they're going to have just as many problems there as anybody else will. But there's just a sort of model that they have of like what it is that's making their beliefs privileged. Whereas if I say, okay, what is it that's making your set of values privileged? Um, I don't I'm not sure I'm not sure what is there something is there because I mean I guess you wouldn't want to appeal to metaphysics and semantics and so on, but then like so I've got the sort of values that you offer, and then maybe I've got some other set of values that I don't know, some egoists values, and maybe there are other sorts of values as well. Like I can imagine that maybe like maybe I could sort of judge moral theories aesthetically. For instance, I could appeal to
right.
aesthetic values. In fact, yeah, I'll even apply that to like my metaethics and say, look, moral anti-realism is just cooler than moral realism. So yeah, moral realists are a bunch of dorks. Moral anti-realism is really cool. So coolness is the most important norm for me. You know, so,
Yeah.
right. And I'm like, well, how am I to why am I taking like these as being privileged or as giving us the truth? Seems like I could construct the truth just as much for these other options as well.
Um, yeah, I'm still not quite sure exactly what the worry is, right? Because I mean, you're sort of you're admitting that even for the representationalist, you'd say,
Mm.
well, okay, why do I like if a representationalist who's approaching metaethics might say, well, you know, here is what I think truth, consists in, and so given that account, right, these are the true sort of ethical views. But why think that that's what truth consists in? And then you would appeal to either some the same sort of account of truth to kind of explain that, or you would appeal to some other kind of account of truth that maybe applies only to theories of truth or something, right? I mean, it's
Right.
the traditional, kind of whatever trilemma or something. Um, and and so of course I confront the same sort of problem. I would say, certain values are the better ones to hold. They have more there's more specifically ethical value that obtains if you go this way or that way. So it seems like on the face of it, we have structurally the same sort of problem. It's not as if I think the answers they give are in any obvious sense less controversial than my answers. I mean, theories about reference and the theories about truth makers for moral expressions or for anything else are tremendously complicated,
Hmm.
or controversial, right? So I think they face that sort of controversy. Um, I realize that like it's I think widely thought that there's something somehow more contestable or problematically controversial about value than there is about truth, and where that kind of being problematic doesn't boil down to anything that we talked about before. But I think that's what I would want to hear more about, and that I'm inclined to deny. I mean, again, at a certain point you are going to reach bedrock, and I'm just going to have to say, um, yes, all my evaluative arguments have given out, right? I'm down to my basic intuitions, and that might cause me to be a little bit less certain about those intuitions.
Mm.
It might cause me to look at somebody who holds competing intuitions and say, well, they might not accept them, but that's because they're not my peer when it comes to these matters, right? And that is a commitment of my sort of approach to metaethics, but it's just not at all clear to me that there's not a parallel problem that the representationalist
Yeah.
faces. Um, I mean, they might have better like from a PR standpoint, they might be in better shape. But I don't really care about that,
Right. Well, yeah, maybe it's just that I am expressing a bias from having maybe thought in these terms, and less so in pragmatist terms. I don't know. Um, could you put it this way? So maybe you could sort of bypass questions about what the nature of truth is by just saying, okay, look, uh, there is we take it that there is like there's a world, and then there's like beliefs that correspond to the world, and it doesn't really matter what truth is. The point is we care about correspondence to the world. That's what like we're aiming to achieve, and that's so like when a belief appropriately matches the world in some sense, that's what makes it privileged over other beliefs. um, Whereas it seems like on your sort of approach, it's uh, I, metaphysically unmoored. But then maybe that's just a description of it and not an objection. Actually, as I've said that,
Well,
it's,
nice. I mean, I feel like we're getting to like deep stuff. This is great. So, there are two ways to read um, you know, you claims like, what I care about or what we care about as correspondence. On one of those ways, you're saying that we think, correspondence is sort of truth in the sense worth caring about, or truth of the sort that's worth valuing. And indeed, if you it's surprising, I talk about this in the book too, it's surprising how many philosophers, like when you keep pushing them, they eventually get to these like evaluative claims like, oh, well, I'm not offering a theory of like free will, full stop. I'm offering a theory of free will in the sense worth caring about.
yeah,
Or I'm not offering a theory of what it is for a claim to be representational. I'm offering a theory of what it is for a claim to be representational in the sense that matters. And you're like, oh, that sounds a little pragmatist. So that's one way of reading it, is like you're it's kind of bottoming out in these evaluative claims. Another way of reading it is you're just reporting like what you care about. But of course, I could just make the same move. I could say like, yeah, like, of course there's this evaluative controversy, but like, here are the values that I care about. And if that's, sauce for the goose, it is for the gander too, right? I mean, that doesn't seem like a way of settling the matter, but if it is for the representationalist, it is for me too.
okay, yeah,
Just saying
no,
what I
that
care
that
about.
yes, yeah, that okay. That I suppose that makes sense. Yeah, does that so? What we care about is yeah. What we so if they say what we care about is correspondence, and I guess yeah, so that gives them a way of like claiming that their beliefs are the ones that are privileged. Whereas on your approach, you can just say, well, I care about these values, and so that would similarly just from that, that would just give you a way of claiming that those values are privileged by the same sort of standard the representationalist has used. Yeah, okay.
That's
I think
not the way I'd
okay.
probably go. Like, I
No,
mean, you know what I mean? Like, yeah. But
right.
but if it's the way that they want to go, like, I can
Okay,
do the same
yeah.
thing.
So all right. Well, I guess I should ask what is the way that you would go then, in like accounting for why the values you accept are the privileged ones.
Well, um, so I could, I mean, obviously I can offer, ethical arguments for certain views that I accept, right? So for example, like, suppose I think that there's no morally relevant difference between, doing harm and allowing harm
Hmm.
to happen. Like that's something I think I, accept, and I could, give some kind of further justification for that position. This is some of the stuff I'm working on now, actually. But then that further justification is going to involve some ethical premises as well.
Yeah.
And so really the question is, okay, once all of the ethical argument has given out, right? Once I've reached, you know, you know, premises that I can't offer any kind of further justification for, why go with those rather than a competing set of premises or competing set of values? Um, and then it is then I think that, I mean, I kind of want to say what I said before, which is the fact that there seems to be at a certain point this sort of parity, right, might make me a little bit less certain of my values. That's fine. That's, I think, consistent with my metaethical stance. It also might make me inclined to to just think that somebody who accepts the competing set of views is just not my peer.
Hmm.
That I'm my set of values is just privileged um, and that's it, right? And that sounds like an undesirable thing to say, right? But I think we just need to be careful here, because I think it like the reason why it's undesirable to say that in other domains of inquiry, right? Like things are simply, this way and there's no explanation of that. Those have to do with features of those domains specifically. But I mean, it's my position that once you really see how ethical inquiry works, that it's this kind of strange, kind of significant, but in some way non-substantive, right? It doesn't afford truthy values. Once you see it's like how odd it is, I actually do think it becomes less strange to say, yeah, there's simply like a sphere of like correct values and there's no further justification for those, but that doesn't mean that those aren't the correct values. Is that they're brutally correct, to use
Yeah.
somewhat Anscomian terminology.
So is there a worry here that okay, you take it that you've got the correct values, but I mean, there's no explanation for why they're correct, and like I can see it. Somebody saying, well, there's maybe like a sort of debunking argument lurking here, where you know we can imagine like a whole load of different sort of sets of values. I mean, you've got the egoist values, you've got the coolness, like maybe like, these
Yeah,
like weird aesthetic values that I've chosen to adopt for the purposes of this conversation. And um, so like if we can't say what makes these values correct, I mean, like what sort of justification do we have for assuming that we've like gotten the right ones? In fact, it almost seems like we should think, okay, so these values, there's no like metaphysical story about what how they manifest. About like, okay, these values are naturalized, so we can't tell like any kind of causal story about how they're affecting us or anything like that.
right.
It's just like we have these values, and we've got the correct ones. There's no further explanation for why they're correct, and it seems like just a remarkable coincidence that we would have gotten the correct ones out of the many possible value sets available, um, given
Really?
this background.
I mean, you seem pretty empathetic and you seem like a bright guy. This seems like not so much of a coincidence that you would glom on to the correct values. I mean, it's a little
Well,
flippant, but I mean, that's the kind of answer that I would give is what makes it more likely that I would arrive at the correct set of values than Genghis Khan would. And I would point to differences between me and Genghis Khan. Like, I think I'm probably much more empathetic, maybe smarter, right? Not militarily, but philosophically. I mean, I point to stuff like that. I talk to smarter people all of the time. Like I'd give those kinds of answers. Um, I mean, ultimately, there is a kind of um, you know, there are different sorts of, like, there are trade-offs of, if you will, like sort of theoretical virtues, right? Like I do think that in normative ethical inquiry, that all else being equal, you want to reduce bruteness um, as much as you can, right? So like all else being equal, it's better to have an ethical system that just has, whatever, a couple, maybe even one foundational principle than it is to have just like 4,000 completely disconnected principles that don't really seem to support one another. All else being equal, I think that's the case. Um, so I do think that you want to reduce bruteness as much as is possible, but I think that has to be traded off against um, other things, like, for example, like extensional adequacy, right? In an ethical theory, you want the ethical theory to say the right sorts of things, but the question of how to trade off bruteness against extensional adequacy in ethics, again, because I'm a quietist, is not going to be something that's like settled by standards that are somehow external to ethics. Like that's going to be an ethical question itself. Like how much does it matter that our theories like say the right things about what to do, and how much does it matter that they support one another? I mean, I mean, I sort of get the worry here, but I don't think there's anything outside of ethics that you can use to that you can use to kind of settle the question one way or the other. And sort of from within the ethical standpoint, at least these are my ethical views. From within the ethical standpoint, I don't think that, like, reducing bruteness to zero is like the kind of sole theoretical desideratum.
Right.
Um,
Yeah. Maybe just to go back a bit to like why I would be worried that whether or not I've got the right values. It just seems, I suppose, maybe part of what motivates the worry is, um, well, I know that like I'm wrong about a whole load of other things, or at least maybe not wrong, but I'm kind of misled maybe about various other things. I mean, so arguably, color perception is misleading about. So it seems to present me, with like objects that have certain intrinsic color properties, but maybe we don't want to say that. Maybe when we look at color science, it turns out that that's not really a sustainable view of what's going on. And so I guess what most people would be inclined to say about this is, well, yeah, I mean, perception misleads you in certain respects, but even so, we can tell this story about the way that external objects are and the way they influence your perception, which is going to be sort of self-vindicating, right? It's going to show from within the story that even though it's maybe not true that colors are intrinsic properties of objects, still objects have like surface spectral reflectances, and there are distinctions between objects that are correctly tracked by color perception. You might tell a story along those lines.
yeah.
So, and it does seem to be the case that just like there's all sorts of aspects of our minds that mislead us. And I guess with the case of value, it's yeah. I just think like okay, I don't know. I mean, I mean, obviously, I am gonna say that it's better to be empathetic, and like people who are empathetic tend to have what are, from my point of view, better values. But that's because I value empathy, like so I'm
Right.
yeah. So it doesn't seem sort of self vindicating in the way that the perception story is. Um, yeah, so that I still have a bit of a worry, I guess, that my values are the correct ones.
So, right. I mean, I think you you're right to separate um, two sorts of concerns. One is with whether your sort of position, we might say, begs the question against an opponent. I think any sort of position is going to beg the question against certain sorts of opponents. Like I
Yeah.
think if you want to avoid question beggingness, like you're kind of traveling down the road to skepticism.
Mm.
And I think another issue is whether your position is capable of sort of self-vindication, and I think also whether the vindication it's offering of itself is sort of in line or unified with the kind of vindication that it's offering of other positions and other domains that seem intuitively to be worthy of vindication. But actually, I mean, I'd be interested to hear what your doubts are here. But actually, I do think that that is kind of what I'm trying to do as a pragmatist. I'm trying to offer an evaluative vindication of ethics in terms of what I'm calling specifically ethical value ultimately. But that's in line with my vindication of sort of every other position and domain that I take to be worthy of vindication, and that might be done in terms of different values, like what I was calling the truthy values, like and in particular representational value. Um, but I actually do take myself to be offering a sort of general kind of vindicatory strategy that like as it were sort of captures or whatever vindicates the truths in sort of domains across the board, and ethics is just one of them.
Mm-hmm.
um, um, so yeah, it doesn't seem, and I actually talk about this in the book, it actually doesn't seem all that different from a theory of um, the kind of perceptual case that you were talking about, or a theory, let's say a theory of like how a priori knowledge is possible that explains not only a priori knowledge in math or ethics, but also explains knowledge of that very theory. That's the kind of thing that, I mean, maybe the kind of explanation doesn't work for other reasons, but it seems like that kind of unified explanation is actually pretty similar to what I'm offering here.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Um, yeah. Uh, I don't know. I suppose I always sort of get stuck on this point that it's like, well, like I can kind of put myself in the shoes of somebody who just has this totally different value system, and then it seems like okay, they can just use the same sort of machinery, as it were, to vindicate their position. But then I feel like I can't, from my position, say what's wrong with them doing that. Whereas I can in the perceptual, or maybe yeah, I don't know, because I can in the perceptual case. Um, but then I suppose if I already have a certain set of values, I can just use those values to say what's wrong with their vindication of their values. Um, so maybe it is on a par. I'm
And I think
yeah.
it's on a par with, I have a certain view about truth, or about what grounds what, that sort of thing. I look at people with competing views, and I think they're they're wrong, and they give some kind of you know theory of what makes their theory of truth true, or they try to ground their claims about grounding and so forth, and I disagree with that. Um, it might be as a psychological matter that you're sort of more confident in the claims that you'd want to make about truth or grounding. I mean, than you are in your um, evaluative views. But I guess I'd want to say that doesn't strike me as a deep difference, right?
Actually,
That's a psychological difference. You're more confident in one case than the other,
yeah.
but it's not as if you're somehow in a better epistemic position vis-a-vis people with radically different views about truth or about what there is than you are um, vis-a-vis people of radically different values. You might think that those two cases are epistemically different if you had a different background, sort of meta-ethical picture, but like, you know, kind of what I'm trying to do in the book is like take us out of that
Right.
sort of picture.
Yeah, actually, I'm inclined to say that I'm probably more confident of value claims, but that's just because I take an anti-realist line on it, and I just think that when I make value claims, I'm just expressing that I'm not even attempting to track whatever the truth may be, or describe properties in the world or anything like that. I can be very confident. But yeah, I don't know actually. Maybe if I adopted your view, I'd become a lot less confident. But
All right, well,
yeah, I don't know whether that would be a
don't
good
don't
thing.
adopt my view then. I mean, just I mean,
Um, yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I guess that those are the sort of main points. I think I don't know if there was any. Was there anything else you sort of wanted to cover today?
no. I mean, like, I mean, if there are any sort of meta-ethical issues that you sort of wanted to get into, sort of independently of like what specifically is in my book, I'd be very open to talking about those. Like, um, you know, for example, like like what we should say about the things like the meanings of concepts like good or bad or right or wrong. Yeah, anything that
Mhm.
you wanted to talk about that's like it's not just about the book. Yeah.
Um, well, you did say a bit like earlier that you were kind of unsatisfied with the sort of account that both cognitivists and non-cognitivists give of the meaning of moral judgments. I think that my take on this is, I mean, so the sort of view I have is, well, um, I tend to think that like neither of these theories is right because I just assume that language in general is very vague and messy, and I would assume that there are probably cases which are uh, where it's more appropriate to give like a cognitivist analysis of the meaning of moral judgments. I think that debates between academic philosophers about ethics are maybe a good example of a case where that might be appropriate. But then there are cases which just seem much more in line with what the non-cognitivists say. And I suspect there's also going to be a lot of cases where I would just say it's completely indeterminate what these judgments mean. Um, so, I don't really have like a position on the meaning of moral judgments. The best that I could do would be some sort of like explicative theory where it's like, okay, I'm proposing this theory of the meaning as some sort of conceptual engineering. Like, let's like try to precisify our moral concepts. Let's take this vague, messy thing and try to precisify it. And here's the best way of doing that. But that's as much as I could come up with. And yeah, so I find that like a lot of the meta ethics that took place over the 20th century, I think was maybe misguided in thinking that there's going to be
Yeah.
some sort of universal theory. But you said that you also had some misgivings about that traditional distinction, so I don't know if you want to talk a bit about that.
Yeah, well, I guess I mean my view about these things tends to be like I mean I'm not a semanticist, and and I'm not like you sort of an expert on how people exactly use moral expressions, and so my view is partly going to be stipulative. Like so when I talk about ought, there's a certain kind of concept that I mean to pick out,
Hmm.
and the if you ask me to sort of define ought or define a reason or something like that, I would not take you up on it. Instead, I would want to say that the concept is distinguished by its role, but it's not a role, vis-a-vis some other kind of concept. In particular, it's not a role vis-a-vis some non-evaluative concept. Like I don't think you can define good or ought or reason in non-evaluative terms. I think I'd want to define or I'd want to characterize those concepts in terms of the relation to things like motivation and affect and so forth. So, like a concept like just like the ordinary, ought, is, basically works like this. If you believe that you ought now to phi and you're capable of phying, doing some action, then you'll be motivated to at least some extent to phi, and that's how the concept works. Um, I think other people like me who are cognitivists think that there's something somehow unsatisfactory about that, because if that's all there is to the concept, then it doesn't seem like that's enough to really determine, an extension. It's not enough for it to be the case that there are really some things that you ought to do,
Mm.
right? And so then you see people like offering sort of, these referential theories of ought, or like, trying to say that there are like constitutive connections with non-evaluative concepts like this sort of Schaefer, Landau, and Cuneo, like moral fixed points kind of stuff. And I like, but that's the kind of thing that you would, I think, would worry about if you were not a quietist. So as a quietist, I just think, there are right answers about what you ought to do, and that um, it's sort of no concern that the only kind of characterization of ought that you can give is in terms of motivation, right? Like we don't need moral fixed points. We don't need a partial definition in terms of anything else. We don't have to show that we don't have to resort to some theory of reference for evaluative expressions, that sort of thing.
Okay, so how? But if we say that, like, so for it to be the case that like I ought to phi it. So I mean, because surely I mean you wouldn't want to say that like you know the fact that I ought to phi is just going to be dependent on my desires or anything like that. So
Right.
you have a what I guess what you said is you have this account of the role of ought where it's like if I believe that I ought to phi, then I'm going to have some motivation to phi, but it's not the case that the ought is going to be reduced to my motivations or anything like that.
Yeah, it's not like I'm not defining um, I ought to phi as I am motivated to
Yeah.
phi, right? Any more than if I sort of tried to give the constitutive role of a concept by saying, okay, if you believe something is F, then you'll be disposed to believe that it's G. There's a difference between doing that and saying that it's part of the definition of F, that something about my belief in that's being G. Yeah, so it's not. I'm not defining ought in terms of my motivations. I'm saying that the way that the concept ought works is that if you think you ought to do something, then you'll be, and it's something that you are now capable of doing, that you'll be motivated to
Mm.
do that thing. And there's more to say about how exactly the sort of mechanics of all that work, and the debates about that. But
Mm-hmm.
for my purposes, I don't see that account of the concept ought as being somehow inconsistent with truth or objectivity. If you're not a quietist, I think you would have real worries about that. So I think, like, I know you talked about this in another video, like people like Schaefer, Landau, and Cuneo, they see something like this moral fixed point strategy is really crucial to explaining how it is that evaluative concepts can have an extension, whereas I don't.
Yeah. So with this thing about like thinking you ought to do something and being so, I think like the way that I make sense of those sorts of claims, and I mean, so this is just how I make sense of it to myself when I am like, I don't know, if I'm sitting down and I look out the window, I see it's raining, and so I say, okay, I ought to get a coat, or if I see somebody in pain and I say I ought to help them. Um, to me, I think like what I'm saying is, well, I just I have certain motivations, I have certain goals, such as staying dry or such as reducing the amount of pain in the world. And then there are certain actions that are going to best achieve that. And, these actions do not interfere with my other goals in any relevant ways. So, like, that's it. That's all the claim amounts to. Now, presumably, you wouldn't, like, the way that I'm accounting for my own use of ought statements, I guess that has to be wrong on your view, because if that's how
Yeah.
I'm using the term, then actually, like, oughts and reasons just do reduce to my goals, or, like, means end relationships.
Well, on your view, I mean, and I realize there's more to say about this. Take a statement like, um, if I you know if I had the goal of committing genocide or something, then or if I said, even if it were the case I had the goal of committing genocide, I ought not to do it. Now, that to me seems correct, right? I still ought not to commit genocide, even if that were my goal. But the more important thing from my point of view is not just actually that's correct, but it's whether it's correct or incorrect. It's truth or correctness doesn't seem to be ruled out conceptually.
Hmm.
Whereas on your view, it seems like that the truth of that counterfactual claim would be ruled out conceptually.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it seems like going too far, but I don't.
Yeah, no, I,
It's hard
I,
to-
I, I get the concern. It's more just like, so I suppose it's the concern. So the worry that I have is this: it's that I'm not sure that I really like. I'm not sure I really know what, like, oughts or reasons actually are, right? And so if somebody, I mean, I'll use that language, I'll use the terms, and if somebody asks me
Yeah,
what I mean, then I can give an account along the lines I just gave, where I can talk about goals, I can talk about ways of satisfying goals. And it's like, okay, well, that makes sense to me. Um, and but then, when it comes to sort of stance independent oughts, stance independent reasons, I just find myself running into a bit of a fog. And I take a point, right? Do I want to say that a claim like, if I wanted to commit genocide, uh, then I ought to commit genocide, right? Wait a minute, what was the claim exactly that's being ruled out? Um,
It-
if I,
um, I even if I had wanted to commit genocide,
yeah,
I ought not to
ought not to do
commit
it. Yeah,
genocide.
so I ought not
Yeah.
to do it, right? I don't. Yeah, I don't want to say that that's ruled out conceptually, and I mean, I think I'd probably just give this sort of line where I say, well, you know, I can evaluate these sorts of claims in different ways. So when I'm evaluating that claim under normal circumstances, I'm just sort of using the uh, the sort of desires and goals that I currently have, which include um, the desire not to be the sort of person who commits genocide. But I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure that's a particularly satisfying explanation. Um, and so I take I take your point, and it's a concern that I have, but I don't know how else to account to, like, explain what a stance independent ought is. Um, but then maybe on a sort of quietist view, I don't need to explain what it is. Maybe I'm just engaging in this sort of illegitimate move to metaphysics and semantics when I ask that sort of question.
Well, that's what, like, I mean, if the I would want to push back against if someone were to come to me and say, well, what is a reason, or define ought or a reason, or something like
Mm.
that. I think I would want to push back against just that question. I think that I can give an informative characterization of how the concept works, again, vis-a-vis motivation, or something like that. And that's all I'd want to say, at least about the kind of big, all things considered, sort of ought. And I think when you get into like definitions like you're giving, I mean, you run into these, it seems to me like you run into these problems of certain things being ruled out by the content of the concept that seem like they shouldn't be ruled out. And you get into, issues about how, well, are you really then, can you really disagree with somebody who thinks that there are stance independent truths about what you ought to do? It seems like you're not really disagreeing because they must be using a different
Mm.
concept than you're using if it's part of the concept that it's stance dependent
Yeah,
in this
yeah.
way. I mean, I guess the way I'd look at my characterization of the concept is it's an informative characterization, but it's not a definition. And um, a quietist like me will say, okay, that's consistent with its having, an extension. Someone like Schaefer Landau, or for that matter, someone like Anscombe would say, no, if that's all there is to the concept, that's not enough for the concept to have an extension. And then you got to get into whether quietism is the right way to go or not.
Yeah, so actually I am inclined to agree about this point that maybe I can't really maybe I can't actually disagree with somebody who's claiming that there are stance independent oughts or stance independent reasons, and like I'm not even so much putting this forward as like an objection, right? It's just more like, okay, I think that I think I've realized that one of the things that bothers me about realism, or one of the things that sort of stops me from being a realist or an objectivist, is maybe I just don't understand it, right? Maybe I just don't actually have, like, there are some versions of it that I understand. I think I understand like naturalist approaches and so on, but then
Yeah.
maybe there are these versions of realism that um, are invoking this concept of stance independent oughts, and I, for one reason or another, just sort of haven't got my head around it. It seems strange that I wouldn't be able to understand that. Um, so I guess like,
Yeah.
is it would your view be that, like, look, we have this so we have this concept of ought, right? And there are various like contexts in which we appeal to this context, and it seems to be, like a perfectly uh, legitimate word in the sense that it's like rule governed, and we can associate it with other things like the motivation and so on. So is it so like that's enough for it to um, for it to like that's okay then, so like that's a legitimate concept. And is it that, like, as long as I can use the word in the sort of standard ways that it's used, that I just do understand the concept? um
Um, I'm not sure how to answer a question about understanding. I mean,
yeah.
I think like what it, I mean, yeah, I'm not sure what it takes exactly to count as understanding a concept. I mean, I do think it's sort of incumbent upon somebody who's working with a concept to be able to say that there is indeed something that makes it the concept that it is and not some other concept,
Hmm.
right? If somebody says, what's the difference between the concept ought and the concept, I don't know, wrong or something, you should be able to give a sort of adequate account of that. And I think that my account account does that. Um, but yeah, it's I'm not quite sure what to say about. I mean, obviously, I would want to say that the average person sort of basically understands um, uh, ought and so forth. But I mean, it kind of gets into issues that I don't really have a firm view on.
Okay. Okay. um cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. uh yeah. Okay. Well, I think that was everything then. If there's anything else you want to mention, then you can go ahead. Um,
No, I mean,
No?
I guess the only thing I'd say is, very much enjoyed this conversation. And if anybody watching this, like, I don't know, has any questions or counter arguments or whatever, like, just, you can find my email on the University of Toronto faculty, website. Just, you can send me an email. I'd be happy to talk about this stuff with anybody who's interested.
Yeah, thanks for coming on. For yeah, and I suppose we should say as well, the book is available, and there'll be details of that in the description, right? So,
Yeah, there'll be details in the description and a discount code in the description. So, yeah,
yeah, okay. Well, I will. All right, I'll say goodbye, and I'll end the recording here. So, um,
awesome.
goodbye, YouTube. All
All right.
right.
Bye, everyone. Thank you, Kane.